The train station was a world of its own, a giant echoing box of noise and light and constant motion. It had a rhythm, but it was a messy one. The thump of suitcases being dragged, the statusy crackle of announcements no one quite listened to, the shuffle of 1,000 feet on worn stone floors. And in the middle of it all, near the information booth with its flickering screen, stood the piano. It was a nice one, a Yamaha, sleek and black. A sign beside it said, "Play me, I'm yours," in cheerful letters. People did, sometimes. A tired parent would let their child plonk out chopsticks. A college student would try to remember the opening of a Beatles song, give up, and walk away. The notes always sounded small and lonely in the big space, swallowed up by the noise. She was part of the station's furniture. That's how most regulars would have thought of her, if they ever thought of her at all. A woman who looked to be in her late 50s, always dressed in simple, tidy clothes, a neat coat, sensible shoes. She appeared every evening, just as the commuter rush was thickening into its most desperate phase. She didn't rush. She would walk calmly to a particular wooden bench that gave her a clear view of the piano and sit down. She'd place her sturdy canvas bag beside her, take out a thermos, and sometimes pour herself a cup of tea. Then she would just watch Dot. She watched the people who approached the piano, the bold teenagers laughing and shoving each other, the shy man who would look around twice before sitting down to play a quiet, sad little melody, the little girl with red shoes who would bang on the keys until her mother pulled her away. The woman's face was peaceful, a gentle mask. Her eyes, though, were active. They followed the hands on the keys. She would wince, just a tiny flicker. When a note was badly out of tune, the station's humidity was not kind to the instrument. A faint, almost invisible smile might touch her lips when someone managed a clean run of notes. It was the smile of someone recognizing a familiar, distant road. She was always alone. She never took out a phone. She never read a book. For 1 hour, she simply observed the piano and the life that clumsily danced around it. Then she would pack her thermos back into her bag, stand up, and melt into the crowd heading for the regional rail lines. She was a ghost in the machine of the station, a silent witness. Her name was Clara, and her real life was a quiet one. She worked as an archivist in a musty, beautiful old library across town. Her world there was one of silence and dust and careful order. She spent her days preserving letters from centuries ago, touching the fragile pages with gloved hands, deciphering faded handwriting. She liked the stillness. She liked that the stories were finished, their joys and sorrows settled and put away in acid-free boxes. There was no noise in her work, only a deep, patient quiet. Her apartment was the same. Small, clean, everything in its place. Books lined the shelves, sorted not by color, but by a system only she understood. There were no photographs on the walls or the mantelpiece. The only thing that might strike a visitor as unusual was a large, rectangular space in the center of her living room floor, where the wood was less faded, as if something very heavy had sat there for a long time and had only recently been moved out. No one at the library or in her apartment building knew anything about her past with music. Why would they? She never spoke of it. She didn't hum while she worked. Her fingers, when they weren't wearing archival gloves, were often still, resting in her lap. The memory of the piano was a room in her mind she had locked and thrown away the key to. Or so she told herself, but the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. Sometimes, when she was sorting through a box of old concert programs in the library vault, her hand would tremble. The feel of the thick, textured paper, the smell of the ink, it would send a jolt through her, a feeling like a missed step on a staircase. She would close her eyes, and for a split second, she wouldn't be in a vault. She'd be in a practice room, the light slanting through a high window, a metronome ticking like a mechanical heart, more vividly, her hands remembered. When she watched the people at the station piano, her fingers would curl slightly in her lap. They would press against the fabric of her coat, tap a silent, complex rhythm on her knee. It was a muscle memory, deep and ingrained. Her hands knew the weight of the keys, the stretch of an octave, the smooth glide from a white key to a black one. They remembered running scales for hours until they felt like liquid. They remembered the terrifying, exhilarating feeling of her fingers flying across the keyboard in a concert hall, a sea of faces ablur beyond the stage lights. That had been a lifetime ago. She had been a child then, a girl with a gift so big it felt like a burden. The piano wasn't a toy. It was her entire world. Her teacher, a kind but demanding old man who had been a friend of her grandfather's, saw the spark in her. He nurtured it, pushed her, believed in her with a ferocity that was both wonderful and frightening. He wasn't just teaching her notes. He was teaching her a language for every emotion she couldn't yet name. The piano became her voice, but that voice was silenced. Her teacher, her mentor, the closest thing to a guiding star she had, passed away suddenly. It wasn't just a loss. It was an eclipse. The music, which had been a living, breathing thing between them, died with him. To play after that felt like a betrayal. It felt like speaking into a void where no one would ever answer again. The piano in their home, the one that had taken up most of the living room, became a monument to grief. One day, when the silence in the house became too loud, she called some movers and had it taken away. She was 19. She built a new life, piece by careful piece. A life of quiet routines, of predictable silence. The archive suited her. It was full of finished stories. There was no performance, no audience, no terrifying potential for joy or failure. There was just the peaceful work of preservation. And yet, for years now, she had been coming to the station. She told herself it was just a place to sit, to watch the flow of humanity before going home to her quiet apartment. But she always chose the bench with the view of the Yamaha. She was drawn to it, like a sailor to a siren's rock, but a sailor who refused to get on the boat. She was testing herself, or perhaps taunting herself. She would listen to the clumsy, brave, silly attempts of strangers and feel a confusing stew of feelings pity. Nostalgia, a deep, aching emptiness, and a tiny, forbidden flicker of envy for their simple, unafraid enjoyment. On this particular evening, the station was more crowded than usual. A delay on the main line had caused a bottleneck of irritated people. The air was thick with damp wool and frustration. A young man with a backpack slung over one shoulder sat at the piano and began to play a popular rock song. He played it loudly, with more energy than accuracy, pounding the keys to be heard over the din. It was aggressive and sour. People winced as they walked past. Clara watched from her bench, her usual calm expression on her face. But inside, something tightened. It was a physical reaction, a clenching in her chest. It wasn't annoyance at the young man. It was something else. It was the sound of the music being wrong. It was the sound of the beautiful, complex language she had once known being shouted in ugly, mangled sentences. It was like watching someone misuse a precious, fragile book. The young man finished with a final crashing chord and got up, looking pleased with himself. The discordant echo of the piano strings hung in the air, mixing with the station's noise. And in that moment, something in Clara's careful, quiet world broke open. A thought, clear and sharp as the ring of a tuning fork, struck her. No, it wasn't a decision made with her mind. It was a pull from a place much deeper, a place her hands remembered. She felt her body moving before she knew what it was doing. She stood up from her bench. Her legs, which felt strangely light, carried her across the floor. The crowd seemed to part for her without noticing. Her heart was a wild drum in her ears, louder than all the station sounds. She reached the piano. The black wood gleamed under the fluorescent lights. She looked at the keys, a landscape of white and black she had traversed 1,000 times in dreams. She slowly, carefully lowered herself onto the worn piano stool. It was still warm from the last player. She placed her canvas bag on the floor. The station roared around her, a baby crying, a conductor yelling, a suitcase tumbling over. She took a breath that didn't feel like it reached her lungs. She lifted her hands. They didn't tremble. They hovered over the keys, and for the first time in 35 years, Clara prepared to play. The stool was still warm. That small, mundane detail cut through the fog in her mind. Someone else had just been here, someone who played without thinking, without this crushing weight of history. Her own hands hovered above the keys, pale and looking almost unfamiliar against the black and white. They were the hands of an archivist, with short, neat nails. For a terrifying second, they felt like someone else's hands entirely. The noise of the station was a solid wall around her. A man on a cell phone yelled about a delayed meeting. A child whined for a pretzel. The loudspeaker crackled with static. It was all so ugly, so ordinary. It was the perfect opposite of the silence before a performance, the sacred hush she remembered. This was not a concert hall. This was a messy, noisy, real place. And she was sitting in the middle of it, exposed. Her heart wasn't just beating. It was thrashing, a wild bird trapped in her chest. She thought she might be sick. Asterisk, what am I doing? The voice in her head was sharp with panic. Asterisk, get up. Walk away. Go home. Asterisk, this was a mistake. A moment of madness brought on by a long day and that awful, crashing rock song. She started to pull her hands back, to retreat. This wasn't her world anymore. Her world was quiet boxes and finished stories. But as her fingers began to lower, they didn't curl into her palms. Instead, almost of their own will, they descended. Not to play, but to touch. Her right index finger softly pressed down on middle C dot. The note was out of tune. Just slightly flat. It had a dull, woolly sound to it, worn down by the station's air and 1,000 careless fingers. It wasn't a beautiful sound, but it was a real sound. It vibrated up through her fingertip, into her hand, her wrist. It was a physical feeling she had not felt in decades. It wasn't the perfect, maintained tone of a concert grand. It was the sound of this piano, here, now. Alive and a little broken. Something inside her, something that had been clenched tight for 35 years, loosened. Just a fraction. Without letting herself think, she let her other fingers find their places. Her left hand settled into a low, dark chord. Her body was remembering the posture, the curve of the spine, the angle of the arms. It was like sinking into a chair you'd sat in every day of your childhood. Her mind was screaming, but her body was coming home. She took another breath, deeper this time. She closed her eyes, not to shut out the station, but to listen to the noise inside it, to find a space within the chaos. She thought of her old teacher, not the grief, not the loss. She thought of his voice. Music isn't in the quiet room, he'd said once, when she was frustrated by a noise outside the window. It's what you pull out of the noise. Find the melody in the mess. Her fingers pressed down. The sound that came out wasn't a melody. It was a single, complex chord. It was rich and strange, full of notes that didn't seem like they should fit together, but they did. It wasn't loud, but it had a presence. It didn't fight the station's noise. It cut straight through it. It was like a clear, cold stone dropped into muddy water. A few people glanced over. A woman dragging a suitcase slowed for a step. It was just a chord. Probably another weirdo. They kept moving. Then she began to play. It started softly. A questioning series of notes in the right hand, a deep, rolling murmur in the left. It was Chopin, the ballade, a piece of terrifying, stormy beauty, a piece she had learned as a teenager, a piece her teacher said contained an entire story of love and loss and rebellion. She hadn't practiced it. She hadn't even thought of it. But her hands knew. They remembered the map. For the first 20 seconds, it was just a woman playing piano in a station. A few more people noticed. A couple stopped, thinking they might hear a familiar tune. But this wasn't familiar. It was intricate, winding, full of shadows and light. It demanded attention. A young man wearing headphones, waiting for his train, pulled one ear cup away. His eyebrows went up. He didn't know classical music, but he knew this wasn't normal. This wasn't background noise. He tapped the shoulder of his friend and nodded toward the piano. The music began to build. Clara was no longer thinking. She wasn't even really her anymore. She was a vessel. The fear was gone, earned away by the sheer physical act of playing. Her fingers, which felt stiff at first, were now moving with a speed and certainty that defied logic. Arpeggios flew up the keyboard like showers of sparks. Deep bass notes rumbled, felt in the chest as much as heard. The story of the music was unfolding a story of gentle longing that suddenly erupted into a furious. Passionate stormed out the station began to change. Conversations trailed off, not all at once, but in a wave. Someone said, "She, listen." The crowd near the information booth slowly turned, like flowers to a sun. People moving toward exits slowed, then stopped. They leaned against pillars, set their bags down. Faces that were bored, irritated, tired, began to soften. They looked confused at first, then surprised, and intently focused. A construction worker in dusty boots sat right down on the floor, his back against a trash can, and closed his eyes. A mother hushed her children, and instead of fidgeting, the kids stood still, wide-eyed, watching the woman's hands blur across the keys. An elderly couple held hands, their faces gentle with memory. They didn't know the piece, but they knew the feeling it carried. The music was now a force in the station. It filled the vast space, not by being loud, but by being so completely present. It wrestled with the echo and won, turning the station's cavernous ceiling into part of the instrument. The announcements from the loudspeaker now felt like an intrusion. A rude interruption. Clara was deep inside the storm of the piece now. The technically difficult parts, the coda that had made her weep with frustration as a girl, flowed from her without effort. It was as if all those years of not playing were just the drawing of a bowstring. Now the arrow was released. Her face, which had been a mask of concentration, changed. A tear escaped from under her closed eyelid and traced a path down her cheek. She wasn't crying from sadness. She was crying from the sheer, shocking release of it. The music was speaking everything she had locked away, the grief, the love for her teacher, the lonely years, the quiet resignation. It was all pouring out through her fingertips, and it was transforming from private pain into something heartbreakingly beautiful. Every single person in earshot was still. Phones were in hands, but they weren't being checked. They were being raised, slowly, to record. Little squares of light focused on her, but she didn't see them. The world had shrunk to the feel of the keys, the vibration of the wood, the story she was telling. The final, furious run of notes approached, the one that felt like a heart breaking and soaring at the same time. She gathered every bit of feeling, every memory, every silent year, and poured it into the keyboard. The notes cascaded down like a waterfall, powerful and precise, ending with two final, stark, resonant chords, bang, bang. Then silence. It was the most profound silence the train station had ever known. The usual noise was gone, held at bay. For a full 3 seconds, no one moved. No one breathed. The last note hung in the air, vibrating slowly into nothing. Clara's hands fell into her lap. She was trembling, spent. She felt hollowed out, and yet more full than she had in decades. She slowly opened her eyes, and saw the crowd, hundreds of people. Standing, sitting, on the stairs, all frozen, all looking at her. Their faces were open, stunned, some wet with tears. They filled the space, a silent, awestruck sea. Then, as if a spell broke, the silence erupted into sound. But it wasn't the sound of the station. It was a roar of applause. It was shouts and whistles and cheers. It was thunderous, overwhelming, coming from every direction. People were clapping so hard, their hands must have hurt. The construction worker got to his feet, whistling through his teeth. The children jumped up and down. Clara flinched, the sudden noise crashing into her. The world, her real quiet world, rushed back in. The heat of a blush spread up her neck to her face. This was what she had always feared. The eyes, the noise, the exposure. She wasn't a vessel for music anymore. She was just a woman on a stool, completely seen. In a daze, she reached for her canvas bag. She stood up, her legs wobbly. She gave the crowd a small, frantic, almost apologetic nod, and then she turned and walked quickly, head down, into the nearest crowd of people, disappearing into the stream of humanity as if she were trying to become a ghost again. But she wasn't a ghost anymore. Behind her, the applause continued, mixed with sounds of disbelief. And in 100 phones and 100 video files, the moment lived on. The unknown woman at the Yamaha piano was already gone. But what she had left behind was just beginning. The walk home was a blur of streetlights and echoing sound. Not the sound of the station, but the sound of that applause ringing in her ears like a phantom noise. Her whole body was trembling, not from cold, but from a kind of shock. She felt like she had been turned inside out. All the quiet, private things inside her had been played aloud for strangers. And now she was just an empty, shaking shell trying to get back to its corner. She didn't remember climbing the stairs to her apartment. She just found herself inside, the familiar silence wrapping around her like a blanket. She leaned her back against the closed door and slid down until she was sitting on the floor. Her fingers were sore. She looked at them in the dim light from the window. They looked the same. How could they look the same? They had just done something impossible. The quiet of her apartment felt different now. It wasn't peaceful. It was waiting. It was full of the ghost of the music she had just set free. She could still feel the vibration of the keys in her fingertips. She made tea, her movements automatic, but her hands shook so badly the spoon clattered against the mug. She tried to tell herself it was over. A one-time lapse. A strange bubble that had burst and would never come again. She would go back to work tomorrow, to the silent archives. She would not go back to the station. Never again. The piano bench had been warm, and for 8 minutes she had been someone else. Now she needed to be Clara the archivist again, the woman no one noticed, but the world had other plans. While she sat in her silent kitchen, the videos were spreading. They jumped from phone to phone, from text thread to social media feed. They weren't professional recordings. They were shaky, often starting halfway through the piece, sometimes with someone's thumb partly covering the lens. But they all captured the same thing, the ordinary-looking woman in the neat coat, creating something extraordinary from a public piano. The comments started simply. Who is she? This is in Philly. I walk past that piano every day. What song is this? It's breaking my heart. Then the algorithms took over. The videos were shared by people who loved classical music, by people who loved a good mystery, by people who just needed to see something beautiful in their feed. Overnight, one particular clip where the camera had been close enough to catch the tear tracing down her cheek during the quiet middle section, hit 1 million views. Then by the next morning, it was a full-blown internet mystery. News websites, always hungry for a feel-good story, picked it up. The headlines were all some version of "Mystery Station Pianist Stuns Commuters with Breathtaking Performance." Clara knew none of this. She went to work as usual, head down, grateful for the library's hushed atmosphere. But the silence there felt fragile. Her coworkers, usually focused on their own cubicles, seemed to be whispering a little more. One of the younger assistants looked up from her computer, glanced at Clara, then looked again with a strange expression, before quickly turning back to her screen. It was at lunchtime that the bubble truly popped. She was in the staff room, eating a sandwich and staring blankly at the wall, when the assistant from that morning came in, her phone in her hand. She looked nervous. "Clara?" she said softly. I think this is you." She held out the phone. On the screen, paused, was a clear image of Clara herself. Eyes closed, hands on the station piano keys. The headline above it screamed, "Have you seen this musical genius?" Clara's blood ran cold. The sandwich turned to dust in her mouth. She felt exposed, as if she were standing there naked. She managed a stiff shake of her head. That's a mistake. It just looks like me." Her voice sounded thin and false even to her own ears. The young assistant just nodded, but her eyes were full of knowing wonder. "It's okay," she whispered. "It's really beautiful." She took her phone back and left the room. That was the beginning of the end of her anonymity. By the end of the workday, it was worse. As she left the library, she saw a man with a camera lingering near the steps. He wasn't a tourist. He had a certain hungry look. She pulled her coat collar up and walked quickly in the opposite direction, her heart hammering. Her quiet, predictable walk home was now a gauntlet. Every glance felt like a recognition. When she turned onto her own street, she stopped short. There were 2 cars parked oddly near her building. A woman was standing on the sidewalk, holding a notepad. A reporter. Clara ducked her head and practically ran around to the building's back entrance, her keys fumbling in her sweaty palms. She got inside, slammed the door, and slid the bolt shut. She peered out the tiny window in the door. The woman with the notepad was now talking to her elderly neighbor, who was pointing toward the building. Panic, a clean and sharp terror, rose in her throat. They had found her. Her sanctuary was breached. For 2 days, she didn't leave the apartment. She called in sick to work, something she almost never did. She stayed away from the windows. The doorbell rang several times. She didn't answer. Her phone, a simple flip phone she barely used, started buzzing with calls from numbers she didn't know. She turned it off and put it in a drawer. The world wanted the story. But they didn't just want the performance. They wanted the why. Why was a woman of such staggering talent hiding as a librarian? Why had she stopped? Where did she come from? The mystery was the fuel. News vans parked on her street. They interviewed anyone who would talk. Her quiet neighbor, bewildered but kind, said, "She's a lovely woman. Very quiet. I had no idea. She keeps to herself." This only made the story more tantalizing. Reclusive librarian is secret piano master. The classical music world wants answers from the station virtuoso. Clara felt like an animal trapped in a spotlight. She pulled all the curtains closed and sat in the dark. The music that had felt like a release now felt like a curse. It had ripped open her carefully constructed life. She mourned her quiet bench at the station, her silent desk at the library. She had been safe there. Now she was a headline. On the 3rd morning, a thick envelope was slid under her door. It wasn't a bill. With trembling hands, she opened it. Inside was a letter on heavy, expensive stationery. It was from the director of one of the city's most prestigious music conservatories. He had seen the video, he wrote. He was frankly astonished. He spoke of her profound musicality and flawless technique. He said a talent like hers was a national treasure and should not be hidden. He formally invited her to come to the conservatory to meet, to perhaps even discuss a teaching position or a guest artist residency. Enclosed with the letter was a printout of an online article. It was a review, but not of a concert. It was a renowned concert pianist, a man whose name she recognized from her childhood, analyzing the station video on a popular culture website. She forced herself to read it. Everyone is asking what she played, he wrote. But they should be asking how she played it. This is not someone who has been practicing in a basement for years. The technical command is supreme, yes. You can't fake that coda. But that's not what moves me. What moves me is the story, the silence between the phrases, the ache in the quieter passages. This is someone who has lived a whole life away from the piano and has brought all of that life back to it. This isn't just skill. This is a soul returning to its native language after decades of silence. The music world doesn't just need her to play. It needs to listen to what she's saying. Clara read the last line over and over. A soul returning to its native language. She let the pages fall to the floor. She looked around her dark, silent apartment. She looked at the empty space on the floor where her family's piano had once been. The fear was still there, a cold stone in her gut. The outside world was loud and demanding and scary, but for the first time since she played that first chord, another feeling was there too, whispering underneath the panic. It wasn't confidence. It wasn't joy. It was the faintest flicker of something like recognition. This man, a stranger, had heard more than just notes. He had heard her. The silence, the years, the loss, he had heard it all in the music and said it had value. The world was at her door, not just with cameras and noise, but with an invitation to speak that language again. And for a reason she couldn't yet understand, the thought of never touching a piano again suddenly felt like a different kind of death. The silence of her apartment was no longer a shelter. It felt like the silence she had been running from all along. She had to make a choice. She could hide forever, change her name, move away. Or she could step out of the dark. She didn't know what she would say. She didn't know what she would do. But as she sat on her floor, the city buzzing hungrily outside, she knew the woman who had sat unseen on the station bench was gone. The music had seen to that. Now, she had to decide what came next. The silence in her apartment had a new quality to it. It wasn't just empty anymore. It was waiting. It was full of the echo of that letter, of the concert pianist's words. A soul returning to its native language. The phrase played on a loop in her mind, softer than the panic, but just as persistent. For 2 more days, she lived in a kind of limbo. She moved from room to room, tidying things that were already tidy. She tried to read, but the words swam on the page. The world outside her window continued its noisy siege. She saw a news van still parked down the street. It felt less like an attack now, and more like a foolish, stubborn monument to a misunderstanding. They were waiting for a virtuoso, a mysterious genius. She was just a tired woman who had played one piece of music from a place so deep inside she hadn't known it was still there. The fear was real. The thought of opening the door to those cameras, of having to speak, made her throat close up. She had spent a lifetime avoiding being seen. But a new thought, fragile as a seedling, was pushing through the hard soil of her fear. It was a simple question. Asterisk, what am I so afraid of them finding? Asterisk, they already had the performance. They had the genius. The only thing left to find was her. The real her. The woman who loved quiet mornings, whose hands could mend a torn book page with infinite care, who had loved her teacher and missed him every day, who had found a sad kind of peace in putting history in order. Was that so terrible to show? On the morning of the third day, she did something ordinary. She made a pot of strong tea. She sat at her small kitchen table, the steam warming her face. She looked at the business card that had come with the conservatory letter. She picked up her old flip phone from the drawer, turned it on, and watched it light up with missed calls. She ignored them. With a finger that only trembled a little, she dialed the number for the largest local newspaper. When a voice answered, she spoke quietly, but clearly. "My name is Clara Vance. I am the person from the train station video." There was a stunned silence on the other end, and a flurry of activity. She cut through it. "I will give one interview. One. Not at my home. You can choose a place. I will answer questions. After that, I ask to be left alone." She hung up before they could ask anything else. Her heart was pounding, but it was a clean, sharp feeling. It was the feeling of stepping off a ledge, not knowing if you would fall or fly. The newspaper, of course, agreed immediately. They set it for the next afternoon in a quiet room at the public library's main branch, a place that felt neutral. That felt like her territory. When the time came, she dressed simply. She did not try to look like a performer. She looked like herself. Walking into that room was harder than walking up to the piano had been. A reporter, a woman with a kind but sharp face, and a photographer were there. The reporter introduced herself, her voice gentle. "Thank you for doing this," she said. "We can stop any time you want." Clara nodded, sat down, and folded her hands in her lap. They were the same hands. She held on to that thought. The questions started softly. Did she remember that evening? What had made her finally play? Clara's voice was low at first, a little rusty from disuse. She spoke about the bench, the years of watching. She spoke about the noisy station and the wrong chord, and the feeling that had risen up in her, simple and clear as a note. No? And the piece? Why that one? The reporter asked. "It was the last piece my teacher was helping me master before he passed away," Clara said. The words, once said, didn't hurt as much as she feared. They just were. "I never finished learning it. Not back then. I suppose I finished it the other night." The reporter's eyes softened. She asked about the years of silence. Here. Clara paused. She looked down at her hands. It wasn't a punishment. It was a retreat. The music was so tied to him, to that love. When he was gone, the music felt like a room filled with his absence. I couldn't go in, so I closed the door. I found other rooms to live in. The archive. It's full of finished stories. There's a peace in that. And do you regret closing that door for so long? Clara thought for a long moment. I regret the grief. I don't regret the life I built. It was a good, quiet life. It protected me. But the piano, it wasn't a ghost. I was treating it like a ghost. That night, I think I was just finally ready to stop being afraid of it. The most expected question came. What's next? The conservatory has offered you a position. Will you perform? This was the question she had wrestled with in the dark. She looked directly at the reporter. No, she said, and saw a flicker of surprise. Not in the way they mean. I am not a concert pianist. That was a different person, a long time ago. That life requires a different kind of fire and a different kind of armor. I don't have that armor. She took a breath. But I am not closing the door again. The music is not in a concert hall for me. It's in the living of a life. She explained, her ideas forming even as she spoke them aloud. She talked about the public piano, how it belonged to everyone and no one. She talked about the children who banged on it, the teenagers who tried. That piano is more important than any stage. It's where music meets people who aren't looking for it. That's what I want to be part of. She said she would go back to the station, not to perform, but to play, for herself and for anyone who wanted to listen in passing. She talked about wanting to volunteer, to teach simple music to children who might never afford a lesson, not to make them prodigies, but to give them a language for their feelings. She mentioned the music therapy program at the local children's hospital, and how she wanted to learn about that. It's not a comeback, she said, a small, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time. It's a reintegration. I found a piece of myself I had left behind. Now I want to sew it back into the fabric of my life and maybe help mend a few other small tears in the world while I'm at it. The interview lasted an hour. The reporter asked no cruel questions, dug for no painful secrets. She just listened. The article came out the next day. The headline was not what Clara expected. It didn't call her a genius or a mystery. It read, ****, the station pianist finds her new key, a quiet life, loud with meaning. ***, it quoted her extensively. It spoke of her grief, her quiet career, her fear, and her gentle, firm plans. It painted a picture not of a hidden star, but of a whole, complicated human being who had made peace with her past and was charting a humble, generous future. The effect was immediate, but it was different. The news vans packed up within a day. The story was no longer a mystery. It was a portrait. It was complete. The public's hunger was satisfied, but in a deeper way. They hadn't gotten a spectacle. They had gotten a story of healing. People wrote letters to the newspaper, real letters on paper, saying how her words had moved them more than the video. They spoke of their own lost passions, their own quiet griefs. A few days later, in the evening, Clara put on her coat. She felt a nervous fluttering, but it was mixed with a new sense of rightness. She walked to the train station. For a moment, she stood at the edge of the bustling hall, looking at the Yamaha. It was just a piano again. No crowd awaited. No cameras. Just the usual flow of tired people. She walked over and sat down. A few people glanced her way. One young man did a double take, his eyes widening. He nudged his friend and whispered. Clara ignored it. She placed her hands on the keys. This time, there was no monumental Chopin. She played a simple, warm, melancholic piece by Schumann, one that felt like a memory of a happy dream. She played for about 10 minutes. Some people stopped to listen for a minute or two before moving on. A few sat on the floor. One woman cried softly, but she was smiling. It was beautiful, but it wasn't a shock. It was a gift, left on a bench for anyone who needed it. When she finished, there was soft, scattered applause, not a roaring ovation. A little girl came up, her eyes huge. "That was pretty," she whispered. "Thank you," Clara said, her voice warm. "Can you play happy?" The girl asked. Clara smiled. "I can try." She began a soft, lullaby-like melody. The girl sat down right there on the floor, chin in her hands, and listened until her mother took her hand to catch their train. As Clara got up to leave, an older man in the station custodian's uniform was polishing the brass railing nearby. He nodded to her. "Nice to have you back," he said, as if she'd just returned from a short trip. "Adds a little class to the place." She nodded back. "It's nice to be back." She walked home, the city sounds a comfortable blanket around her. She wasn't a ghost. She wasn't a star. She was a woman who played the piano, and that was finally perfectly enough. The noise had found its place, and the silence within her had found its voice. They were learning to live together. The autumn turned to winter, and the winter slowly gave way to a hesitant spring. The story of the station pianist, as all stories do, faded from the front pages and the buzzing news feeds. It settled, instead, into the grain of the city itself, becoming a piece of local lore, a "did you hear about that time?" story told between friends. For Clara, life did not become a grand concert tour or a series of glittering events. It became something better. It became whole. She kept her job at the archive. She still loved the quiet there, the smell of old paper, the patient work of preservation. But it was no longer a hiding place. It was just where she worked, a thing she was good at. Her coworkers, after a period of gentle curiosity, treated her normally again. Though sometimes, on a quiet afternoon, one of them might say, "That piece you were humming, Clara, what was that?" And she would tell them. True to her word, she returned to the station piano. She went in the evenings, 2 or 3 times a week. It was not a formal performance. It was more like a conversation with the space. Sometimes she played the great, passionate works from her youth: Brahms, Liszt, Rachmaninoff. Other times she played gentle folk tunes or fragments of jazz standards she'd heard on the radio. She learned to ignore the phones held up discreetly at the edge of her vision. They didn't feel like a threat anymore, just a fact of modern life. The important thing was the immediacy of the sound, the couple that stopped to share a smile, the business person who closed their eyes for a full 3 minutes before rushing to their platform. She became, quietly, a fixture. Regular commuters would time their walk through the main hall to catch a few minutes of music. They didn't crowd around. They just listened as they passed, a little island of beauty in their hectic day. The station custodians knew her by name now. They'd give her a nod, and sometimes she'd play a deliberately silly papa tune as they mopped nearby, just to make them chuckle. But the most significant change happened away from the public eye. After a series of quiet emails and meetings, Clara began volunteering. She didn't go to the Grand Conservatory. She went to the Greenwood Community Center, in a part of the city where funding for the arts had dried up years ago. On Wednesday afternoons, she sat in a sunlit room with scuffed floors and an old, donated upright piano that was badly out of tune. Her students were children, aged 6 to 12. They came from families where rent was a worry and grocery bills were a math problem. A piano lesson was a fantasy. Clara did not teach them to be prodigies. She didn't drill them on scales with a stopwatch. In fact, for the first few weeks, she barely taught them any notes at all. She taught them to listen. They would sit on the floor, and she would play a low, rumbling cluster of notes. "What does that sound like?" she'd ask. "A bear waking up." A small boy would shout. "Thunder that's far away," a girl would say softly. She taught them that the high, tinkling keys could be rain or laughter. She showed them how a major chord felt like sunlight, and a minor chord could feel like a cozy, rainy afternoon inside. She let them press their small hands on top of hers to feel the vibration of the wood when she played something loud and joyful. When they finally began to learn proper notes, it was through songs they knew, simple movie themes, pop songs they heard on the radio. Clara's approach was patient. For one little girl, who was painfully shy and never spoke above a whisper, Clara found she could play "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star" perfectly by ear after hearing it once. But the girl froze when she saw sheet music. So Clara threw the book away. "You don't need it," she said. "Your ears are your map. Let's just play." The girl's playing wasn't technically perfect, but it was fluid and full of a natural rhythm. For the first time, the girl left the lesson with a smile that wasn't hesitant. One boy, who was always getting into trouble at school for his explosive energy, found an outlet in the piano's lower keys. Clara taught him how to create a thunderstorm with his left hand. He'd pound out dark, rumbling chords, his face a mask of fierce concentration. And then, spent and calm, he'd finally sit still. Clara wasn't just giving them music. She was giving them a language for all the things they couldn't yet say, their excitement, their sadness, their anger, their wonder. She saw herself in them, not as prodigies, but as children in need of a key to a room inside themselves. One chilly April evening, after her community center class, she was walking home. She passed the train station but didn't go in. She felt a different pull. She walked to the city's children's hospital, a place she had started visiting once a week as part of their music therapy program. Here, the piano was on wheels. She would roll it into different rooms. She played for children who were bored and restless, for parents who looked hollowed out with worry. She never played sad music. She played music that was a companion. Soft, meandering melodies for a child fighting pain. Bright, rhythmic tunes for a teenager staring out the window. In one room, there was a little boy about 5 who was very sick. He was often quiet, withdrawn. His mother said he loved trucks. So that day, Clara didn't play Chopin. She invented a song on the spot, with a steady, chugging rhythm in the left hand and cheerful, honking little melodies in the right. She created a truck driver's grand adventure. She made sounds for gears shifting, for horns blasting, for the rumble of going over a bridge. For the first time in days, the little boy laughed. A real, bubbly, helpless laugh. His mother cried, but they were happy tears. She grabbed Clara's hand and just held it, wordlessly. Clara played the silly truck song for 10 straight minutes, until the boy, exhausted but smiling, fell asleep, walking home that night. Under a sky just beginning to show its first stars, Clara felt a profound and simple peace. This was the music that mattered, not the music that sat in silence on a stage, waiting for perfection, but the music that rolled into a hospital room. The music that helped a stormy child find his thunder. The music that turned a public train station from a noisy cage into a place where, for a few moments, people remembered they had souls. Her own piano, the one from her childhood, was still gone. She had not replaced it. She didn't need to. The city was full of pianos, now the out-of-tune one at Greenwood, the wheeled one at the hospital, the sturdy Yamaha at the station. They were all hers, and they were all everyone else's. She finally understood what her teacher had meant all those years ago. Music wasn't about the quiet room. It was about what you pulled out of the noise of life. Her life had been noisy with grief, then noisy with silence, then noisy with fame. Now it was simply noisy with living. And the music was the thread she wove through it all, connecting her to others, mending the small, torn places. She was not impressive because she could play a difficult piece. She was impressive because she had chosen to come back, not to a stage, but to the world. She had taken her gift out of the locked room and decided to use it as a tool for kindness, for connection, for quiet joy. The woman on the bench was no longer just waiting and no longer just playing. She was living. And the life she was living, with its simple acts of listening and sharing, was the most beautiful song she had ever composed.